When the world was young, long before the ice came and covered the lands in frozen silence, the world looked very different from what we see today. The oceans were lower, the coastlines stretched far beyond where they rest now, and massive bridges of land connected continents that we think of as separate. This was a time when humanity was not yet writing its stories on paper or stone, but was living them day by day in ways we are only beginning to understand. The earth was warmer in many places, and where deserts now stretch for endless miles, there were once green valleys filled with rivers and forests. Animals that would later disappear walked freely across plains and through woodlands, and among them moved people who had dreams, fears, hopes, and knowledge that would one day be buried beneath ice and water and time itself. These were not primitive people stumbling through a dark and savage world, though for many years that is how we imagined them. They were human beings just like us, with the same capacity for love, creativity, wonder, and intelligence. They looked at the stars and wondered what they were. They gathered around fires and told stories. They made tools that suited their needs with remarkable cleverness, and they passed knowledge from one generation to the next, building upon what their ancestors had learned. They created art that still moves us when we find it painted on cave walls or carved into stones that somehow survive the ages. They understood the patterns of animals and plants, the turning of seasons, and the ways of the natural world with a depth that many modern people have lost. Their civilizations rose in places we have forgotten or never knew existed, and when the Ice Age came sweeping down from the north, much of what they built and knew was destroyed, buried, or washed away. For thousands of years, scholars believed that civilization began only a few thousand years ago in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, that before those great cultures there was nothing but wandering hunters living hand to mouth with no time or inclination for anything we might call culture or society. But as archaeologists began digging deeper and looking more carefully at sites around the world, a different picture started to emerge. They found structures that were far older than they should have been, according to the old theories. They discovered evidence of trade networks spanning vast distances, of people who worked together to create monuments requiring organization and planning, of knowledge about astronomy and mathematics that seemed impossibly advanced for the time periods assigned to them. The more they looked, the more they realized that the story of human civilization did not begin where they thought it did, and that before the Ice Age there were peoples and cultures whose achievements have been largely forgotten or dismissed. Chapter 2. The People Who Knew the Stars. In the time before the Great Ice, there were people scattered across the world who watched the sky with intense focus and deep understanding. They were not doing this as a hobby or simple curiosity, but because their lives depended on reading the heavens correctly. The movements of stars and planets told them when to plant crops, when to hunt certain animals, when to expect floods or droughts, and when to prepare for changing seasons. They built structures aligned with incredible precision to solstices, equinoxes, and the rising points of specific stars, showing knowledge of astronomy that scholars once believed impossible for people without telescopes or advanced mathematics. These astronomical alignments appear at sites all over the world, from Europe to Asia to the Americas, suggesting that many different cultures independently recognized the importance of celestial patterns, or perhaps that knowledge spread between groups in ways we do not yet understand. The sophistication of this astronomical knowledge challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient peoples. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, which dates back more than 11,000 years to just after the Ice Age ended, massive stone pillars carved with animals and symbols were arranged in circular patterns that align with celestial events. This temple complex required organization, planning, and a workforce that could be fed and coordinated, all before agriculture was supposed to have been invented according to traditional timelines. If people could do this right after the Ice Age, what were they doing before it? What knowledge survived the catastrophe, and what was lost forever beneath the ice and rising seas? The answer suggests that complex societies with organized labor, specialized knowledge, and long-term planning existed much earlier than conventional history books admit, and that these societies must have developed during the long ages before the ice came. These ancient astronomers understood that the Earth moved through space in predictable cycles. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, a subtle wobble in Earth's rotation that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete and causes the position of stars to slowly shift over centuries and millennia. This knowledge appears encoded in myths and monuments from cultures around the world, all describing the same cosmic cycles in different symbolic languages. They spoke of great ages of the world, of the rising and setting of specific stars, marking the passage of vast stretches of time, of catastrophes that ended old worlds and began new ones. These were not simple superstitions, but sophisticated attempts to record and preserve knowledge about patterns in nature that span time periods longer than any individual life or even any single civilization's existence. The people before the Ice Age were trying to leave messages for the future, warnings perhaps, or simply the desire to say, "We were here, we understood this much, we saw this beauty in the heavens and wanted you to know it too." These were not primitive people stumbling through a dark and savage world, though for many years that is how we imagined them. They were human beings just like us, with the same capacity for love, creativity, wonder, and intelligence. They looked at the stars and wondered what they were. They gathered around fires and told stories. They made tools that suited their needs with remarkable cleverness, and they passed knowledge from one generation to the next, building upon what their ancestors had learned. They created art that still moves us when we find it painted on cave walls or carved into stones that somehow survive the ages. They understood the patterns of animals and plants, the turning of seasons, and the ways of the natural world with a depth that many modern people have lost. Their civilizations rose in places we have forgotten or never knew existed, and when the Ice Age came sweeping down from the north, much of what they built and knew was destroyed, buried, or washed away. For thousands of years, scholars believed that civilization began only a few thousand years ago in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, that before those great cultures there was nothing but wandering hunters living hand-to-mouth with no time or inclination for anything we might call culture or society. But as archaeologists began digging deeper and looking more carefully at sites around the world, a different picture started to emerge. They found structures that were far older than they should have been, according to the old theories. They discovered evidence of trade networks spanning vast distances, of people who worked together to create monuments requiring organization and planning, of knowledge about astronomy and mathematics that seemed impossibly advanced for the time periods assigned to them. The more they looked, the more they realized that the story of human civilization did not begin where they thought it did, and that before the Ice Age there were peoples and cultures whose achievements have been largely forgotten or dismissed. Chapter 2. The People Who Knew the Stars. In the time before the Great Ice, there were people scattered across the world who watched the sky with intense focus and deep understanding. They were not doing this as a hobby or simple curiosity, but because their lives depended on reading the heavens correctly. The movements of stars and planets told them when to plant crops, when to hunt certain animals, when to expect floods or droughts, and when to prepare for changing seasons. They built structures aligned with incredible precision to solstices, equinoxes, and the rising points of specific stars, showing knowledge of astronomy that scholars once believed impossible for people without telescopes or advanced mathematics. These astronomical alignments appear at sites all over the world, from Europe to Asia to the Americas, suggesting that many different cultures independently recognized the importance of celestial patterns, or perhaps that knowledge spread between groups in ways we do not yet understand. The sophistication of this astronomical knowledge challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient peoples. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, which dates back more than 11,000 years to just after the Ice Age ended, massive stone pillars carved with animals and symbols were arranged in circular patterns that align with celestial events. This temple complex required organization, planning, and a workforce that could be fed and coordinated, all before agriculture was supposed to have been invented according to traditional timelines. If people could do this right after the Ice Age, what were they doing before it? What knowledge survived the catastrophe and what was lost forever beneath the ice and rising seas? The answer suggests that complex societies with organized labor, specialized knowledge, and long-term planning existed much earlier than conventional history books admit, and that these societies must have developed during the long ages before the ice came. These ancient astronomers understood that the Earth moved through space in predictable cycles. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, a subtle wobble in Earth's rotation that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete and causes the position of stars to slowly shift over centuries and millennia. This knowledge appears encoded in myths and monuments from cultures around the world, all describing the same cosmic cycles in different symbolic languages. They spoke of great ages of the world, of the rising and setting of specific stars, marking the passage of vast stretches of time, of catastrophes that ended old worlds and began new ones. These were not simple superstitions, but sophisticated attempts to record and preserve knowledge about patterns in nature that spanned time periods longer than any individual life, or even any single civilization's existence. The people before the Ice Age were trying to leave messages for the future, warnings perhaps, or simply the desire to say, "We were here. We understood this much. We saw this beauty in the heavens and wanted you to know it too." Monuments that defy explanation. Across the world stand monuments so ancient and so precisely constructed that they continue to puzzle researchers today. These are not the well-known pyramids and temples of later civilizations, though those are impressive enough, but rather structures and sites that push back the boundaries of what we believe possible for ancient peoples. Many of these structures are made from stones weighing tens or even hundreds of tons, quarried from locations miles away, and somehow transported to building sites without wheels, without metal tools, without any of the technology we think necessary for such work. The stones are often fitted together with such precision that a knife blade cannot slip between them, shaped and smoothed in ways that seem to require advanced tools yet show no evidence of the methods used. Some blocks have been lifted to great heights and positioned perfectly, while others form walls and foundations that have survived earthquakes and centuries of weathering that destroyed later constructions built with more advanced technology. At places like Baalbek in Lebanon, stone blocks weighing over 1,000 tons each form part of an ancient temple foundation. No crane in the modern world could easily lift these stones, yet somehow ancient builders quarried them, moved them, and placed them precisely where they wanted them. In Egypt, long before the famous pyramids were built, there stood other structures whose construction methods remain mysterious. The Sphinx itself may be far older than traditionally believed, showing water erosion patterns that suggest it stood through periods of heavy rainfall that ended thousands of years before Egyptian civilization as we know it began. In South America, the stone walls of Sacsayhuaman fit together like three-dimensional puzzles, with polygonal blocks shaped to interlock perfectly despite each stone having completely different angles and faces. Traditional archaeology assigns these structures to cultures we know about, but increasing evidence suggests that many of them may incorporate much older constructions, built by peoples who lived before the Ice Age and possessed knowledge and capabilities that were lost when their civilizations fell. The purpose of many of these ancient monuments remains unclear, though most scholars assume they were temples or tombs or palaces. But some researchers suggest other possibilities. Could some have been observatories, schools, or repositories of knowledge? Might they have served functions related to sound, energy, or properties of stone that we no longer understand? Ancient texts from around the world speak of wise people in the distant past who possessed great knowledge and taught the ancestors of current civilizations the arts of agriculture, architecture, writing, mathematics, and astronomy. The Egyptians spoke of the time of the gods, when divine beings walked the earth and established the principles of civilization. The Sumerians recorded lists of kings from before the flood whose reigns lasted impossibly long periods, suggesting these were not historical records in the literal sense, but rather mythological frameworks for remembering a distant past. In India, sacred texts describe ages of the world stretching back tens of thousands of years, with advanced civilizations rising and falling in cycles. The Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures maintained detailed calendars tracking vast periods of time and spoke of previous worlds that had been destroyed by catastrophes. In Plato's famous account, he told of Atlantis, an advanced civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time and was destroyed in a day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods. For a long time, scholars dismissed all these stories as pure mythology with no historical basis, interesting as literature and revealing about the cultures that told them, but containing no actual information about the past. But as evidence accumulated of human sophistication at earlier and earlier dates, some researchers began wondering whether these myths might contain garbled memories of real events and real peoples, distorted through thousands of years of retelling, but preserving a core of truth. Could the wise teachers described in myths be survivors from pre-Ice Age civilizations who carried knowledge to new peoples after their own cultures were destroyed? Could stories of great floods and catastrophes be memories of the actual events at the end of the Ice Age when melting glaciers caused seas to rise rapidly, drowning coastal settlements and causing climate chaos? Could the impossibly long reigns of ancient kings be a way of describing very long periods of time before the development of precise dating systems? This does not mean we should accept every myth and legend as literal history, or believe that ancient Atlantis was a technological wonderland with flying machines and crystal power sources, as some popular books claim. Rather, it suggests we should look more carefully at ancient stories for the kernels of historical memory they might contain. When cultures separated by oceans tell similar stories about floods, about stars, about ages of the world, about knowledge brought by strangers from across the sea, there may be something more than coincidence at work. The human capacity for preserving information across generations without writing is far greater than modern people often realize. Oral traditions can maintain accurate knowledge for thousands of years when they are culturally important and carefully transmitted through song, story, and ritual. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have oral histories describing coastal features and animals that have been verified by archaeology and geology to have existed more than 10,000 years ago, before rising seas changed the landscape. If they preserved such memories accurately, why not other peoples? What knowledge might be hidden in myths that we have not yet learned to decode? The artists in the dark. Deep within caves in France and Spain and other parts of Europe, there are paintings created by people who lived during the Ice Age itself, some as much as 30 or 40,000 years ago. These are not crude stick figures or simple handprints, though those exist too, but sophisticated artworks depicting animals with beautiful grace and power, showing movement and life with skill that rivals modern artists. The painters understood perspective, shading, and the use of natural contours in the cave walls to give their subjects three-dimensional form. They often painted in chambers deep within cave systems, far from natural light, in places difficult and sometimes dangerous to access, suggesting these were not casual doodles, but important works created for significant purposes, perhaps ceremonial or spiritual in nature. The effort required to create these paintings, working by flickering firelight or crude lamps, shows dedication and skill passed down through generations of artists learning and refining their craft. What moves people most powerfully when they see these ancient paintings is the sudden recognition that the hands that created them belong to people exactly like us. These were not primitive brutes, but humans with aesthetic sense, with the desire to create beauty, with symbolic thinking, and the ability to represent the world they saw in abstract form on cave walls. When you look at a painting of horses or bison created 20,000 years ago, you are seeing the world through another person's eyes across an enormous gulf of time, sharing a moment of perception and artistic expression that bridges all the centuries between. These artists saw the same stars we see, felt the same emotions, wondered about the same mysteries of existence. They were us, just living in a different time, dealing with different challenges, but fundamentally human in all the ways that matter most. The cave paintings also suggest that Ice Age peoples had complex cultures with time and resources for activities beyond mere survival. Creating these artworks required materials, tools, time, knowledge of painting techniques, and a cultural framework that valued and supported artistic production. This means communities stable enough to feed artists while they worked, systems for training young people in artistic skills, and shared understandings of symbolism and meaning that made the paintings important to the group. Some researchers believe certain paintings may represent star patterns, maps of territories, or records of events, while others see them as shamanic visions or hunting magic. Whatever their specific purposes, they prove that Ice Age humans were culturally sophisticated, mentally modern, and capable of abstract thinking and symbolic representation. If people in the depths of the Ice Age, living in harsh conditions with basic technology, could create such remarkable art, what might peoples living in more favorable times before the Ice Age have achieved? The answer is almost certainly far more than we have yet discovered. Gardens before the flood. For most of human history, people lived by hunting animals and gathering wild plants, moving with the seasons to follow game herds and ripening foods, living in small bands that rarely stayed in one place for long. Then, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, according to traditional timelines, people in several parts of the world independently invented agriculture, learning to plant seeds, tend crops, and store harvested food. This agricultural revolution allowed permanent settlements, growing populations, and eventually cities, writing, and all the other features of what we call civilization. This story has been taught for so long that it became accepted fact, the foundation of how we understand human progress, from primitive hunter-gatherers to civilized farmers and city dwellers. But like many long-accepted stories, it is beginning to look more complicated and less certain than we thought. Recent discoveries suggest that people may have been managing plants and working toward agriculture much earlier than previously believed, perhaps experimenting with cultivation during the long warm period before the Ice Age and then losing that knowledge during the catastrophes that followed, only to reinvent it after the world stabilized. At sites around the world, archaeologists are finding evidence of plant processing, grain storage, and even possibly cultivation at dates far earlier than the supposed agricultural revolution. The traditional timeline shows farming beginning around 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. But if people were building complex structures like Göbekli Tepe right around that same time or even earlier, how are they feeding the large workforce required? How are they supporting populations dense enough to require and justify such monumental constructions? The most logical answer is that they already had systems for producing reliable food supplies, which means agriculture or something like it already existed, which pushes the origins of farming back into the pre-Ice Age period. There is another piece of evidence that troubles the standard story. Many of our important food crops, including wheat, corn, rice, and others, appear in the archaeological record already substantially modified from their wild ancestors, as if the process of domestication happened much faster than should have been possible, or happened earlier than we can currently trace. Ancient crops show signs of selection and breeding that must have taken many generations of careful work by people who understood what they were doing. Some researchers suggest that crop domestication may have begun during the long, warm period before the Ice Age, only to have the plants and knowledge nearly lost during the catastrophe, with survivors preserving seeds and beginning again after the ice retreated. This would explain why agriculture seems to appear rather suddenly in the archaeological record, already fairly well developed. It was not new, but rather rebuilt from fragments of older knowledge, like a civilization rebuilding after war or disaster, using whatever scraps of the old technologies they managed to save. The coming of the cold. For thousands of years, the world had been relatively warm and stable, allowing human populations to grow and cultures to develop across many continents. Then the climate began to change. The process was gradual at first, taking place over centuries, with winters becoming longer and harsher, summers growing shorter and cooler, snow that once melted now remaining year-round in the far north. The change accelerated as more snow and ice accumulated, reflecting sunlight back into space and cooling the Earth further. In a feedback loop, glaciers began to form and grow, spreading south from the Arctic regions, grinding across the landscape and burying everything beneath them. In the mountains, glaciers flowed down valleys, crushing forests and filling riverbeds with ice. The ice sheets grew to be miles thick in places, so heavy that they pressed the very bedrock beneath them down into the Earth's mantle. As the ice advanced, people were forced to move, abandoning lands their ancestors had occupied for countless generations. Entire ways of life became impossible as the environments people depended on transformed. Forests turned to tundra, grasslands became deserts, and the routes people had always traveled were blocked by ice or rendered useless by changed conditions. The sea levels dropped as water was locked into glaciers, exposing new lands but also altering coastlines and changing the distribution of resources. Animals moved or died out, plants disappeared or retreated to smaller refugia, and the human populations that depended on them had to adapt or perish. This was not a quick disaster that struck and was over, but rather a long, grinding change that played out over many generations, with each generation facing harsher conditions than the one before, having to solve problems their parents never faced, losing old knowledge as it became irrelevant, and struggling to create new knowledge fast enough to survive. The psychological and social effects of this long catastrophe must have been immense. Imagine living in a world that was slowly dying, where every elder could remember times when life was easier, when food was more plentiful, when the world made more sense. The old stories about how to live and where to find resources became obsolete. The sacred places of ancestors were abandoned or buried in ice, and the future seemed darker with each passing year. Some groups would have fought wars over shrinking resources and habitable lands. Others would have moved constantly trying to stay ahead of the changing climate, becoming refugees in a world where everywhere was already occupied by other people with no desire to share. Population levels must have plummeted as the carrying capacity of the land decreased. Smaller populations meant less cultural complexity, fewer specialized crafts, less trade, and ultimately the loss of knowledge and skills that required large, stable communities to maintain. This is how civilizations can disappear, not in a single dramatic event, though those happen too, but through the slow erosion of everything that made them work until nothing is left but scattered survivors with fragments of what once was. Survivors and refugees. During the worst of the Ice Age, which lasted for many thousands of years, human beings survived, but only in greatly reduced numbers and in scattered refugia where conditions remained tolerable. Some groups retreated to the south, following the warmth toward equatorial regions where the climate remained more stable. Others found sheltered valleys, coastal areas warmed by ocean currents, or highland plateaus that somehow maintained enough plant and animal life to support human populations. In these refugia, people held on through the long cold, maintaining what knowledge they could, but losing much as the complex social structures and large populations needed to support specialized learning and craft production no longer existed. The survivors were tough, adaptable, and resourceful, but they were also isolated from each other, cut off by ice and distance and hostile territories from other human groups, each small band struggling alone to maintain their existence. Archaeological evidence from the Ice Age shows that humans did more than just survive. They continued to innovate, creating new tool technologies, developing specialized hunting techniques for Ice Age animals, and maintaining cultural practices including art, burial of the dead, and care for the injured and elderly. These were not degraded humans reduced to animal existence, but people maintaining their humanity under incredibly difficult circumstances. They have passed down stories and knowledge to their children, kept fires burning through long winter nights, made music and told jokes, and loved each other through the hardship. The fact that modern humans exist at all proves that our ancestors succeeded in this struggle, that they preserved enough of what it means to be human to eventually rebuild when conditions improved. But it also raises the question of what was lost. What knowledge and achievements of pre-Ice Age peoples failed to survive the bottleneck of the glacial period? When small populations are isolated from each other for long periods, cultural evolution goes in different directions. Languages diverge, and practices that were once universal become local variations. This might explain some of the puzzling similarities found in myths and symbols around the world, as well as the equally puzzling differences. If all these diverse cultures descended from larger, more connected pre-Ice Age populations, they might share common roots that still show through in their stories and symbols, but altered and adapted over thousands of years of isolation.
Some groups might have preserved certain pieces of knowledge while others preserved different pieces. And when they eventually came back into contact after the ice retreated, they each carried different fragments of an older, more complete understanding that none of them fully possessed anymore. The task of reconstructing pre-Ice Age civilizations is like trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle when most of the pieces are missing. The ones you have are scattered across the globe in different museums, and you are not even sure what the original picture looked like. The Great Melting. Eventually, the climate began to warm again. The reasons for this warming are complex and still debated, involving cycles in Earth's orbit, changes in ocean currents, atmospheric composition, and feedback loops between ice, vegetation, and climate. Whatever the exact mechanisms, the glaciers that had covered much of the northern continents for tens of thousands of years began to retreat. But this was not a gentle, gradual process bringing easy improvement. Instead, it was chaotic and punctuated by catastrophic events that would have seemed like the end of the world to the people who experienced them. As ice melted, it formed vast lakes held back by ice dams. When those dams failed, as they repeatedly did, unimaginable floods poured across the landscape, carving new valleys, burying old settlements, and altering the geography of entire regions in days or weeks. The most famous of these catastrophic floods occurred in North America, when glacial Lake Missoula, which contained more water than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, burst through its ice dam. The resulting flood was one of the largest known floods in Earth's history, sending a wall of water across what is now Washington state, carrying boulders the size of houses, ripping away hundreds of feet of soil and rock, and creating the channeled scablands that still mark the landscape today. Similar catastrophic floods occurred in Siberia, in Europe, and anywhere glacial lakes had formed behind ice dams. The roar of these floods would have been audible for hundreds of miles, and the destruction was absolute and instantaneous. Any settlements or peoples in the paths of these floods had no chance whatsoever to survive. Is it any wonder that cultures around the world have flood myths describing the destruction of previous worlds by water? These were not fantasies but memories of real events that were seared into human consciousness so deeply that they have been retold for more than 10,000 years.
At the same time, the melting glaciers poured water into the oceans, raising sea levels dramatically. This process took thousands of years, but included periods of very rapid rise, perhaps as much as several feet per century in some periods, which would have been catastrophic for coastal peoples. Imagine living by the sea and watching it creep closer year after year, knowing that your village will soon be underwater, that the fishing grounds where your people have always harvested food are disappearing, that the routes you traveled along the coast are being cut off. Eventually you must leave, becoming a refugee searching for new lands, competing with people already living in higher areas for resources and territory. This happened to countless communities as the seas rose and drowned the old coastlines. Everything built along those shores, all the settlements and monuments and harbors, slowly disappeared beneath the waves, taking with them vast amounts of evidence about how people lived before the Ice Age. The Great Melting was both an ending and a beginning, destroying the old world while creating the conditions for new civilizations to arise. Footprints in stone. Among the most tantalizing clues about pre-Ice Age peoples are the footprints and tool marks left in places that challenge conventional timelines. In volcanic ash, in ancient lake beds, in rock shelters and caves, archaeologists have found evidence of human presence at dates far earlier than the traditional narratives allow. These discoveries are controversial and often disputed because they do not fit the established story. But they continue to accumulate, suggesting that the story itself may need revision. One cannot simply dismiss evidence because it is inconvenient or because it conflicts with current theories. Science advances by following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to uncomfortable or paradigm-shifting conclusions. Footprints fossilized in stone are particularly powerful evidence because they are difficult to fake and hard to explain away. When human footprints appear in layers dated to periods before humans were supposed to have reached certain areas, it forces a reconsideration of migration patterns and timelines. When tool marks or modified bones show up in contexts thousands of years older than expected, it suggests earlier development of technology and culture. The challenge is that dating ancient materials is difficult and sometimes controversial, with different methods sometimes giving different results, and with various factors potentially contaminating samples or affecting measurements.
Skeptics can always find reasons to question individual anomalous dates, and often they are right to be skeptical because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But when multiple lines of evidence from different sites and different dating methods all point toward earlier human sophistication, the balance of probability begins to shift. One fascinating area of ongoing research involves the dating of rock art and cave paintings, using new techniques that can sometimes date the pigments themselves or the mineral deposits that have formed over them. As this work progresses, some paintings long assumed to be a few thousand years old are turning out to be much older, in some cases tens of thousands of years old. This pushes back the timeline of human artistic and cultural sophistication and raises questions about what other achievements might be similarly older than we think. If art is ancient, what about astronomy, mathematics, medicine, or other forms of knowledge? Could there have been wise people in deep prehistory who understood aspects of nature that we have only recently rediscovered? The evidence is fragmentary and often frustratingly unclear, but it points toward a human past that was longer, richer, and more complex than the simplified narratives we have been telling ourselves for the past century. The builders of the first temples. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey revolutionized archaeology's understanding of early human capability and social organization. This massive temple complex with its carved pillars and sophisticated construction was built around 11,000 years ago by people who were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers without organized religion, permanent settlements, or the social structures necessary for such monumental undertakings. Yet there it stands, undeniable proof that the old timelines were wrong. If people could build such a place immediately after the Ice Age ended, they must have brought knowledge and organizational capacity with them from the Ice Age itself, which means such knowledge and capacity existed earlier than anyone had imagined. Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of human sophistication, but rather evidence of its survival through the Ice Age catastrophe. The site consists of multiple circular structures with massive T-shaped pillars carved from limestone and decorated with detailed bas-reliefs of animals, including foxes, lions, bulls, vultures, and scorpions. Some pillars have human-like features, including arms, suggesting they may represent beings or ancestors of some kind. The level of skill required to quarry, transport, and erect these pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, implies specialized workers, coordination, leadership, and the ability to feed and house a substantial labor force over an extended period of time. This is not something a small band of nomadic hunters could accomplish in their spare time. It requires a society with surplus food production, social hierarchy, shared religious or cultural motivations, and technical knowledge passed down through generations. All of this supposedly did not exist when Göbekli Tepe was built, which means it either developed incredibly quickly right after the Ice Age, or more likely it already existed in some form before the Ice Age and was being reconstructed by survivors who remembered how such things should be done. What makes Göbekli Tepe even more remarkable is that it appears to have been deliberately buried around 8,000 years ago. The builders or their descendants carefully filled in the structures with dirt, preserving them underground where they remained hidden until their rediscovery in the 1990s. Why would people go to such effort to bury a sacred site? Some researchers suggest it was to protect it, to preserve it for the future, perhaps as conditions changed and people moved away. Others speculate about religious or cultural reasons we can only guess at. But the deliberate burial ensured the site's preservation, and its excavation has forced archaeologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the development of human civilization. If we were wrong about when people could build such things, what else might we be wrong about? How many other sites from similar or earlier periods remain undiscovered, still buried or eroded away, or lying beneath the oceans on drowned coastlines? The language of myths. When scholars began seriously studying myths and legends from around the world, they noticed striking similarities in stories told by cultures that had no obvious contact with each other. Flood narratives appear in Mesopotamia, Greece, India, China, among Native American tribes, in Australian Aboriginal traditions, and in the legends of Pacific Island peoples. These stories described a great deluge that destroyed most of humanity, with only a few survivors in boats or on mountaintops who went on to repopulate the world. For a long time, academics assumed these were just natural stories that humans would independently create based on local flooding experiences, or that they spread from a single source through cultural contact, or that they were influenced by the biblical flood story through missionary contact. But the details in many of these myths predate missionary influence and show remarkable consistency beyond what local flooding would explain.
Similarly, myths about ages of the world, about catastrophic destructions and rebirths, about wise teachers coming from the sea or from the stars to instruct primitive peoples in the arts of civilization, appear globally with variations but fundamental similarities. The Greek philosopher Plato wrote about Atlantis based on accounts he claimed came through Egyptian priests who said their records went back thousands of years beyond Greek memory. Hindu scriptures describe cyclical yugas spanning hundreds of thousands of years with civilizations rising and falling through each cycle. Mayan calendars tracked enormous spans of time and spoke of previous world ages that ended in destruction. Are all of these entirely symbolic and mythological with no basis in historical events? Or do they preserve distorted memories of real catastrophes and real cultures that existed before recorded history begins? Modern scholars are increasingly willing to consider that myths may contain kernels of historical truth wrapped in symbolic language. Graham Hancock and others have argued that myths encode astronomical information and historical memories about cataclysmic events at the end of the Ice Age. While many of their specific claims remain controversial, the broader point that myths deserve serious attention as potential sources of historical information is gaining acceptance. When stories have been passed down orally for hundreds of generations, they naturally acquire symbolic elements, divine characters, and impossible exaggerations, but they may still be trying to tell us something true about the past. Decoding these messages requires understanding the symbolic language, the astronomical references, the geological events being described, and the ways that oral traditions transform over time. It is difficult work and easy to get wrong, but when approached carefully, myths may reveal lost history that no other source can provide. Technologies lost and found. One of the puzzles about ancient civilizations is how they accomplished certain feats that seem to require technologies they supposedly did not have. Moving massive stones, creating precise astronomical alignments, drilling through hard rock, cutting and shaping granite, building structures that have lasted thousands of years when later buildings crumbled. All of these achievements suggest knowledge and techniques beyond what we typically attribute to ancient peoples. Modern engineers looking at certain ancient constructions admit they would have difficulty replicating them even with current technology. How then did ancient builders manage it? The usual answer is that they used simple tools and methods but applied them with enormous patience, skill, and labor, which is certainly true for many ancient achievements. But some cases remain troubling even under the most generous conventional explanations. Consider the precision of the Great Pyramid's construction with blocks fitted so closely that modern methods would struggle to match it, or the mysterious drill holes in Egyptian granite that show feed rates far beyond what copper tools could accomplish. Or the megalithic walls in South America with stones shaped so precisely that they interlock without mortar, yet survive earthquakes that destroy buildings around them. Either ancient peoples were far more skilled than we give them credit for, which is certainly possible, or they had techniques and tools that have not survived in the archaeological record, which is also possible, or some of these structures incorporate remains from even earlier constructions built by pre-Ice Age peoples with capabilities we have not yet discovered evidence for. This last possibility is speculative, but not impossible. Stone structures can survive for enormous periods of time while organic materials, metals, and even most technologies leave little trace after thousands of years. It is worth noting that technological knowledge can be lost quite quickly when civilizations collapse. The Romans had concrete that has lasted 2,000 years and whose formula we only recently figured out. Medieval Europeans could not build some of the structures their ancestors had created and thought they must have been the work of giants or magic.
When knowledge is held by specialized craftspeople and not written down, it can disappear in a single generation if those craftspeople die without passing on their skills. If pre-Ice Age civilizations existed, their technologies would have been particularly vulnerable to loss during the catastrophes that ended the Ice Age. Stone structures might survive, but the knowledge of how to build them, the tools used in their construction, the mathematical and engineering understanding behind them, all of that could be lost while the monuments themselves remained as mysterious artifacts that later peoples could not explain. The web of ancient trade. Evidence continues to emerge that ancient peoples traveled farther and traded more extensively than traditional history acknowledges. Materials found in archaeological sites come from sources hundreds or even thousands of miles away, proving that trade networks existed to move goods across vast distances. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources appears in sites far from those sources, showing trade routes that connected distant regions. Copper from the Great Lakes region of North America appears to have been traded widely throughout the continent and possibly beyond. Amber from the Baltic Sea reached the Mediterranean in ancient times. These were not random accidents, but systematic trade relationships that moved valuable materials along established routes through multiple intermediaries. If trade networks this extensive existed in relatively recent prehistory, what about earlier? Could there have been maritime trade networks in the time before the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower and coastlines different? There is increasing evidence that humans were capable seafarers much earlier than previously believed. People reached Australia at least 60,000 years ago, which required ocean voyaging since even at the lowest sea levels, Australia was never connected by land to Asia. If people could cross those waters so long ago, why couldn't they travel along coastlines, between islands, and perhaps even across open ocean? The Polynesian peoples proved that ancient cultures could navigate vast ocean distances using knowledge of stars, waves, birds, and currents, reaching every habitable island in the Pacific long before Europeans ventured far from their coastlines. Could similar maritime capabilities have existed earlier among pre-Ice Age coastal peoples whose settlements are now underwater? The implications of extensive ancient trade are significant for understanding cultural development and knowledge transmission. Trade means contact between different groups, exchange of ideas as well as goods, spread of technologies and practices, and movement of people who carry skills and knowledge with them. It means that cultures were not isolated and independent, but rather part of larger webs of interaction that could span continents. Innovations made in one region could spread widely and rapidly, and knowledge about astronomy, agriculture, architecture, and other fields could be shared across vast distances. If such networks existed before the Ice Age, the destruction of coastal settlements and the isolation of surviving populations during the Ice Age would have broken these connections, fragmenting what had been a more unified world culture into isolated remnants that each went their own way. The rediscovery of long-distance travel and trade after the Ice Age was not necessarily an innovation, but rather a rebuilding of something that had existed before and was lost.
Reading the rocks. Geology provides crucial evidence for understanding what happened to pre-Ice Age civilizations because it tells us about catastrophes, climate changes, and landscape transformations that would have affected ancient peoples. The rock layers record floods, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, rising and falling seas, the advance and retreat of glaciers, and other events that shaped the world humans lived in. By reading these geological records carefully, scientists can reconstruct the challenges and catastrophes that ancient peoples faced, which helps explain why civilizations might have been destroyed or forced to abandon certain regions. This geological context is essential for understanding the human story, because humans do not live in isolation from the natural world, but are profoundly affected by climate, geography, and geological events. One of the most significant geological findings relevant to pre-Ice Age civilizations is evidence for periods of rapid climate change and catastrophic events. The end of the Ice Age was not smooth, but rather punctuated by 7 shifts, including the Younger Dryas period, about 12,000 years ago,
when temperatures plunged suddenly back toward Ice Age conditions for over 1,000 years before warming resumed. What caused this sudden cooling is debated, with theories including the collapse of North American ice sheets disrupting ocean currents, volcanic eruptions throwing ash into the atmosphere, or even a comet impact that some researchers argue caused widespread fires and devastation. Whatever the cause, this sudden climate reversal would have been catastrophic for human populations that had begun to adapt to warming conditions, forcing another round of migration, adaptation, and survival challenges. Geological evidence also reveals that sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age was not steady, but included periods of very rapid rise when ice sheets collapsed suddenly. These pulses of rising water would have been devastating for coastal peoples, who might have lost vast territories to the sea in just a few generations. Some researchers estimate that during certain periods, seas rose by several feet per century, which would have been clearly visible within a single human lifetime, and would have driven populations inland as their traditional territories drowned. Stories of lands lost beneath the waves, found in myths from around the world, may be memories of these actual events. The geological evidence thus supports the idea that catastrophes at the end of the Ice Age destroyed coastal civilizations and forced survivors to rebuild in new locations, carrying with them whatever knowledge they could preserve from the old world that had been lost. The question of Atlantis. No discussion of pre-Ice Age civilizations can avoid addressing Atlantis, the legendary advanced civilization described by Plato that supposedly existed thousands of years before his time and was destroyed in a catastrophic day and night of earthquakes and floods. For most of history, scholars have treated Atlantis as pure fiction, an allegory Plato created to make points about ideal government and the dangers of hubris with no basis in actual history. But some researchers have wondered whether Plato might be drawing on garbled memories of a real place and real events, distorted through thousands of years of retelling, but preserving a core of historical truth. The search for Atlantis has spawned countless theories, placing it everywhere from the Mediterranean to Antarctica, with some claims approaching the ridiculous and giving the whole subject a bad reputation. Setting aside the wild speculation, is there any reasonable case that something like Atlantis existed? The most plausible interpretations suggest that if Atlantis was real, it was not a single island civilization, but rather a conflation of memories about several different places and peoples that impressed the ancient Mediterranean world. It might represent memories of Minoan Crete, destroyed by volcanic eruption and tsunami around 1600 BCE, combined with stories about even older cultures around the Atlantic or Mediterranean, perhaps including pre-Ice Age coastal settlements that were drowned when seas rose. Plato's account places Atlantis 9,000 years before his time, which would be around 9,600 BCE, right at the end of the Ice Age when massive environmental changes were occurring. If there were sophisticated coastal civilizations at that time, and if they were destroyed by the catastrophes attending the Ice Age's end, survivors might have carried stories about these lost homelands that eventually reached Egypt and from there came to Plato. The problem with Atlantis is that it has become so loaded with myth, fantasy, and pseudoscience that serious scholars are reluctant to engage with it at all. But perhaps we should separate the question of whether Plato's specific account is literally true, which seems unlikely, from the broader question of whether advanced pre-Ice Age civilizations existed and were destroyed by geological catastrophes, which seems increasingly plausible. If such civilizations existed, some memory of them might indeed have survived in stories and myths, including possibly the Atlantis tale. Rather than looking for a single lost city matching Plato's description, perhaps we should be looking for evidence of multiple sophisticated cultures around the world before the Ice Age, recognizing that the Atlantis story might be an echo of that broader lost world rather than a description of any single place. This is a more nuanced and probably more accurate way to approach the legend than either dismissing it entirely or accepting it literally. Survivors who rebuilt the world. When the ice finally retreated and the climate stabilized into the warm period we still enjoy today, the survivors of the catastrophic end of the Ice Age found themselves in a transformed world. The landscape had been reshaped by glaciers, floods, and erosion. The coastlines were in completely different places than they had been before. Many familiar plants and animals were gone, either extinct or moved to different regions. The population of humans worldwide had likely been reduced to a small fraction of what it had been at the height of the pre-Ice Age period. But these survivors carried within them the knowledge, skills, and cultural memory of what came before. And they set about rebuilding, establishing new settlements, rediscovering or recreating agriculture, and laying the foundations for the civilizations we do know about from recorded history. This rebuilding was not starting from zero, even though for a long time archaeologists assumed it was. The people who rebuilt were not primitive savages slowly figuring out how to farm and build. They were the descendants of people who had done all these things before. They carried genetic memory, oral traditions, possibly written records or symbol systems we do not recognize, and practical knowledge about countless aspects of survival, technology, and social organization. When agriculture appears in the archaeological records seemingly suddenly and already fairly sophisticated, it is because people were re-establishing practices their ancestors had known before. When astronomical knowledge shows up embedded in early monuments, it is because that knowledge had been preserved through the catastrophe by those who understood its importance. When stories of gods and wise teachers appear in myths worldwide, they may be memories of actual people, survivors from older civilizations who brought knowledge to less affected populations. The early post-Ice Age settlements like Göbekli Tepe should not be surprised to find sophistication at early dates because it was not newly invented, but rather rebuilt from surviving knowledge. We should expect to find anomalies and things that seem too advanced because they are inheritances from an older, largely lost world. And we should recognize that what we call the dawn of civilization around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt was actually the maturation of a rebuilding process that had been going on for thousands of years before that, as human populations were covered from catastrophe and gradually re-established the scale and complexity of social organization needed to support cities, writing, monumental architecture, and all the other features of the civilizations we have detailed historical records of.
What the Earth still hides. Despite more than a century of archaeology, we have barely scratched the surface of what remains to be discovered about ancient humans and pre-Ice Age civilizations. The vast majority of archaeological sites have never been excavated, and most of the world has never been systematically surveyed for ancient remains. New technologies like satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and LiDAR are revealing previously unknown sites at an accelerating pace, suggesting that huge amounts of evidence remain hidden. In tropical jungles, massive ancient settlements have been discovered that were invisible until LiDAR could penetrate the forest canopy and reveal the structures beneath. Under deserts, lakes, and cities, ancient sites lie waiting to be found. And beneath the oceans on the continental shelves, where the coastlines of the Ice Age would have been, vast areas that were certainly occupied by humans remain almost completely unexplored. The underwater archaeology of Ice Age coastlines represents one of the greatest untapped opportunities for expanding human knowledge of our past. These drowned coastlines would have been prime territory for settlement, and if sophisticated pre-Ice Age civilizations existed, much of their evidence lies underwater where we have barely begun to look. The technical challenges of underwater excavation are significant, and it is expensive and slow compared to land-based archaeology, which is why so little has been done. But as technology improves and more resources are directed to underwater investigation, we are likely to find settlements, monuments, and artifacts that will fundamentally change our understanding of human history. The evidence is there waiting, protected beneath sediment and water, preserved in some ways better than on land where erosion and human activity have destroyed so much.
Beyond physical artifacts, there are also opportunities to extract more information from what has already been found. Ancient DNA analysis is revealing unexpected patterns of human migration and admixture. Careful study of myths and symbols using comparative methods is uncovering possible shared sources and meanings. New dating techniques are being developed that can date materials previously thought impossible to date accurately. Computer modeling and statistical analysis can find patterns in archaeological data that were not visible to individual researchers looking at small numbers of sites. As these methods improve and are applied to both new discoveries and old collections sitting in museums, our picture of the human past becomes progressively richer and more complex. The story of pre-Ice Age civilizations is not finished being written, it has barely begun, and the next decades will likely bring discoveries that surprise us and force us to revise our understanding yet again. Lessons from the lost. What can we learn from the lost civilizations before the Ice Age beyond simple historical curiosity? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the fragility of civilization itself. We often think of our modern world as permanent, progressive, and secure, but the evidence from the past show that even sophisticated societies can be destroyed by events beyond their control. Climate change, geological catastrophes, environmental degradation, disease, and conflict have ended civilizations repeatedly throughout human history, and the pre-Ice Age cultures were no exception. They rose, flourished, and fell, leaving behind tantalizing traces that we struggled to interpret. This should make us humble about our own civilization's permanence and motivate us to build resilience against the challenges we face. Another lesson concerns the loss of knowledge. When civilizations collapse, knowledge can be lost remarkably quickly, especially practical knowledge held by specialists or encoded in fragile media. The pre-Ice Age peoples apparently had sophisticated understanding of astronomy, engineering, agriculture, and perhaps other fields, but much of that knowledge disappeared during the catastrophes at the Ice Age's end, because the social structures and populations needed to maintain it were destroyed. We face similar risks today. Much of our knowledge exists in forms that require ongoing technology to access, stored on computers that will be unreadable if the systems that run them fail, or held by specialists whose expertise could be lost if those fields are neglected. Building redundancy, preserving knowledge in multiple forms, and ensuring that critical information is not dependent on fragile systems are important tasks that the loss of ancient knowledge should motivate us to take seriously. Finally, the story of pre-Ice Age civilizations reminds us that history is deeper and richer than we often imagine, that human capabilities and achievements stretch back far before the beginning of written records, and that our ancestors were people like us in all the important ways. They loved, hoped, dreamed, created, and understood. They looked at the same stars and wondered about the same mysteries. They built things meant to last, tried to preserve knowledge for future generations, and left messages in stone and symbol, hoping that someday someone would understand. We are connected to them across vast gulfs of time by our shared humanity. Their story is our story, and understanding where we came from helps us understand who we are and where we might be going. The lost civilizations before the Ice Age are not truly lost, as long as we remember them and continue searching for the truth about what they achieved and what they knew. The long view of history. When we step back and look at the entire span of human existence, the last 10,000 years of recorded history represent only a tiny fraction of the time our species has been on Earth. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for at least 200,000 years and possibly much longer. For the vast majority of that time, we have no written records, and our understanding comes entirely from archaeology, which preserves only durable materials and finds only a fraction of what once existed. The conventional narrative has been that for most of those 200,000 years, humans lived as simple hunter-gatherers, making slow, gradual progress until the invention of agriculture allowed civilization to develop rapidly in the last few thousand years. But this narrative is increasingly challenged by evidence suggesting that the human story was more complex, with rises and falls, sophistication and setback, achievement and loss occurring throughout our long existence. The period before the Ice Age now appears to have been a time of greater achievement than previously recognized, with peoples who had developed complex societies, sophisticated knowledge, and capabilities that we have only recently begun to discover evidence for. The Ice Age catastrophes destroyed much of what they built and dramatically reduced human populations, creating a bottleneck through which only fragments of earlier knowledge passed. The rebuilding after the Ice Age was rapid by archaeological standards, but still took thousands of years, and it did not simply recreate what had existed before, but rather created new forms, adapted to new conditions, carrying forward some elements of ancient knowledge, while losing others and innovating new solutions to the challenges of survival and flourishing. This pattern of rise, catastrophe, partial recovery, and innovation may have occurred multiple times through human history, with each cycle building on what survived from the previous one. Understanding this longer view of history changes how we think about progress, development, and the arc of human civilization. Progress is not linear and inevitable, but rather contingent on circumstances, vulnerable to disruption, and dependent on the preservation and transmission of knowledge across generations. Civilizations are fragile things, more fragile than we like to admit, and maintaining them requires constant effort, adaptation, and care. The lost civilizations before the Ice Age are a reminder that achievement can be lost, that knowledge is precious and can disappear, and that the stability we take for granted is a gift we should not waste. At the same time, the story is ultimately hopeful because it shows that humans are remarkably resilient, capable of surviving catastrophes that would seem utterly devastating, preserving what matters most, and rebuilding even from the edge of extinction. We're the descendants of survivors, carriers of knowledge and capability that stretches back far before recorded history, and that heritage is something to honor and protect.
The story continues. The search for pre-Ice Age civilizations is not an academic exercise confined to dusty museums and obscure journals, but rather an ongoing adventure with new discoveries happening regularly and new questions constantly emerging. Every year brings announcements of sites dated earlier than expected, technologies found in supposedly primitive contexts, and evidence that pushes back the timeline of human achievement. Some of these discoveries are quickly accepted by the archaeological community, while others remain controversial, debated in journals and conferences as scholars argue about dating, interpretation, and implications. This is how science works, through constant questioning, testing, and refinement of ideas in light of new evidence. The story of human origins and early civilizations is not settled, but rather actively being rewritten based on emerging data. Part of what makes this field so exciting is that anyone interested can participate in various ways. New satellite imagery is available that amateur researchers can examine, looking for potential sites. Citizen science projects involve volunteers in analyzing data or cataloging artifacts. Underwater explorers continue to search coastlines for evidence of drowned settlements. And the general public's interest in these questions keeps funding flowing to archaeological projects and ensures the discoveries get attention and scrutiny. The lost civilizations before the Ice Age capture imagination because they represent mystery, because they challenge what we thought we knew, and because they connect us to a deeper past that most people never learned about in school. This popular interest, while sometimes leading to wild speculation and fringe theories, also drives genuine research and keeps important questions alive that might otherwise be ignored by mainstream academia. As we look toward the future, several technological developments promise to accelerate discovery and understanding. Better remote sensing technologies will find sites without excavation. Improved dating methods will clarify timelines and resolve controversies. Ancient DNA analysis will reveal population movements and relationships between groups. Computer modeling will help us understand how ancient peoples could have accomplished feats that puzzle us. An increased underwater archaeological capability will begin to explore the continental shelves where so much evidence awaits discovery. Within our lifetimes, we're likely to learn things about pre-Ice Age civilizations that will surprise us, challenge existing theories, and reveal chapters of human history that have been lost for thousands of years.
The story continues not just in what we discover about the past, but also in how those discoveries change our understanding of ourselves, our capabilities, and our place in the long arc of human existence. Conclusion: remembering the forgotten. The lost civilizations before the Ice Age exist now only as fragments, traces, and whispers from a world that vanished thousands of years ago beneath ice and water and the accumulated dust of centuries. We cannot fully reconstruct what those civilizations were like, what languages they spoke, what dreams they held, or what they believed about the universe and their place in it. Too much has been lost, destroyed by geological catastrophe, eroded by time, or buried in places we have not yet learned to look. But from the pieces that remain, from monuments that still stand and paintings that still glow on cave walls, from myths passed down through countless generations and patterns in the archaeological record that do not fit the simple stories we once told ourselves, a picture emerges of peoples who are fully human in their complexity, capability, and achievement. These ancient peoples watched the stars and understood their patterns across generations. They created art that moves us still with its beauty and skill. They built structures requiring organization, knowledge, and effort that challenge our assumptions about what people without modern technology could accomplish. They developed agriculture or something like it, supporting populations large enough to require and create social complexity. They traded across vast distances, spreading goods and ideas in networks that connected diverse regions. They survived catastrophes that destroyed their worlds and carried forward what knowledge they could preserve, rebuilding in new lands under new conditions, passing down memories that became the myths and legends we still tell today. They were not primitive savages stumbling in darkness, but rather people like us, our ancestors, whose achievements deserve recognition and whose story deserves to be told even in its fragmentary, uncertain form. Understanding these lost civilizations matters not just for historical completeness, but for what they teach us about resilience, about the impermanence of what we build, about the value of knowledge and the ease with which it can be lost. They remind us that we are part of a story far longer than written history, that human capability and achievement reach back into depths of time that we are only beginning to explore, and much of our heritage has been forgotten, but might yet be recovered through careful archaeology, thoughtful interpretation of myths and symbols, and the application of new technologies to old questions. The lost civilizations before the Ice Age are not gone forever, but rather waiting to be rediscovered, their monuments standing as silent testimony, their knowledge perhaps encoded in symbols we have not yet learned to read, and their story calling to us across the millennia, asking to be remembered, understood, and honored. As we face our own challenges of climate change, environmental degradation, and the preservation of knowledge in an uncertain future, the lessons from these lost civilizations become ever more relevant. They show us that no civilization is permanent, that natural forces can overwhelm even sophisticated societies, and that what we build and learn can be lost if we do not take care to preserve it in forms that can survive disruption. But they also show us that humans are extraordinarily resilient, that knowledge can be preserved even through catastrophe if people are committed to passing it on, and that rebuilding is possible even from the most devastating losses. We are the inheritors of a long tradition of human achievement, creativity, and persistence that stretches back far before any written word, and we carry within us the same capabilities that allowed our ancestors to survive and flourish through challenges we can barely imagine. The story of the lost civilizations before the Ice Age is ultimately a story about us, about where we came from, what we are capable of, and what we must do to ensure that our own civilization's achievements are not someday lost beneath the tides of time and change, leaving only fragments for future archaeologists to puzzle over and wonder about what we knew and what we lost.